All right, law of cosines. Now there is a time when you have to use the law of cosines instead of law of sines. Law of sines is way easier. Law of sines yesterday we did a proportion, cross multiplied, solved. That was that quick. They're really fast. Law of sines. Law of cosines, not so much. It's not that it's difficult. It's just that it's a lot of calculator work. It's a lot of plugging into the formulas. You could use one of three formulas. So you can see the three formulas that are on your notes there for you. I'm not making you write them down. I'm not even making you memorize them. You just need to know where they are in your notes so you can find them when you need them. Now the question is, when do you actually need the law of cosines? Now you remember yesterday when we're using law of sines and I asked you where should we start? We always look to see which letter had both values, right? If we had angle A and little a, we could use that. You could use that fraction. Well, in this triangle right here, there is no letter that has both values. This 150 is little c. This 220 is little a, and we have angle B. So we don't have little b, so we can't match that up with angle B. We don't have angle A to match up with little a. We don't have angle C to match up with little c. So you cannot use the law of sines if you don't have two of one letter. So that means we got to use our law of cosines, which would be one of these formulas. And if you look at the formulas, there's a lot of things in common. You've got, if you're looking for a little a, then you're going to be using angle A as your cosine angle back here in the end. And you're using B and C in the middle of the formula. If you're looking for angle or little b, you're going to be using the cosine of angle B. So whatever angle you're looking for, whatever side you're looking for, that's the angle that you're going to be using the cosine of. That's basically what this says right here. Whatever side you're solving for is across from the angle that you're using the cosine of. So if you're solving for little b, you're going to use the cosine of b. If you're solving for little c, you're going to use the cosine of c. Again, you don't have to memorize the formula. You just need to be able to plug them in. You've got to get them to work. So in this case right here, I've got a little c, an angle b, and a little a. So we're kind of forced to solve for the other side. We're kind of forced because this is the angle they gave us, angle b. We're going to need to find little b first. So we're going to have to use the middle formula right here, because that's the one that is isolated little b. So we're going to plug that in. So we're going to do b squared equals, and then a squared is, which one is a? 220, so 220 squared plus, that's 150 squared is our c squared, and then minus 2 times the a and the c again, the 220 and the 150 again, and then times the cosine of 48 degrees. Okay, so yeah, it's long to plug in. It's not something you have to memorize. You just need to be able to plug in the pieces. So you got to see that the 220 was my little a, the 150 was my little c, the 220 again was my little a again because little a is next to the 2, and then little c, and then the cosine of b, which in this case was 48 degrees. Yes? Okay, so let's go ahead and multiply these out. So I'm going to use my calculator here, and you don't have to. I'll just get them for you. 220 squared is 48,400. So I'm going to put b squared equals, and I got 48,400 plus 22,500 is 150 squared. Now, a little tricky here. Be careful. You've got a minus 2, which really means a negative 2 times 220 times 150. If you use one of these calculators, I would put it straight in. Negative 2 times 220 times 150 times cosine of 48, and I'd hit equals. If I have this calculator, if I have a different calculator, like your cell phone, I would start at the back. I would do cosine of 48, or I do 48 cosine, and then I times it by 150, times it by 220, times it by negative 2. Be careful to multiply it by a negative 2. because the cosine, if it's an obtuse angle, the cosine's a negative. And a negative times a negative would end up being a plus here. So you've got to make sure you be careful to put in the negative too. In this case, though, I got a minus 44, 163. So now we're just going to get b squared. So b squared equals, and let's add 48,400 plus 22,500 minus 44,163. You get 26,737. And now how do we get b by itself? Because we don't want b squared. Yeah, we're going to square root both sides. So get the square root of both sides. And that will give you your b by itself. So b equals, and we get square root of 26,737. 163.5 is what you're going to get for b. It's definitely more work than just solving a proportion. You've got to square stuff, you got to add stuff, multiply, you got to square root both sides. A lot more to it than simply setting up a proportion and multiplying the diagonals. So if you had a choice between the two, what would you pick? I pick law of sines because I'd rather just set up a proportion and multiply my diagonals. So when I'm looking for the next letter, I could now look for big A right here. Now I can use what? Law of sines. I have b and I have two b's now. So now I can set up the sine of 48 over the 163.5. That's the sine of b over little b equals sine of a over the 220. So that would be the quick proportion that I could set up now to get the sine of angle A. Now we're going to look for an angle, so that means you got to be thinking about inverses, because to get an angle you got to use the inverse. So sine of A equals, let me multiply sine of 48 in my calculator. Sine of 48 times 220. Get an answer for that. Divide it by the third number, which in this case is 163.5. And you get 0.0.99995. It's really close to 1. Really close. But the more decimals you spread out, the more accurate your answer will be. So when I now use my inverse function in my calculator, sine -1, I do a little -1, and I put in 0.99995. I just put that in my calculator, inverse sine 0.99995. I get 89.4 degrees. 89.4 degrees. So I'm going to put that in angle A right here. 89.4 degrees. Now you did law of cosines once and you did law of sines once. Do you need to do them again to get your last angle?
No.
No, just subtract them from 180. So to get capital C, you're going to do 180 minus 48 minus 89.4. And that will give you your last angle. 180 minus 48 minus 89.4. You get 42.6. And that's degrees. Now before you go to your next problem, you always look back at the answers and see if they make sense. Look at your biggest angle. My biggest angle on this triangle is 89.4. Is my biggest side 220? Then that works. My smallest angle is 42.6. Is my smallest side 150? Yeah, so the triangle works. Make sure that you've got it so that it makes sense. You don't want to submit a triangle that has the biggest side across from the smallest angle. Yeah, that won't work. So make sure you look for that. Okay, to the last one. Now the last one is a little different than the one we just did. Because in this problem, they gave me little b, little a, and little c. Last problem, I had one angle with two sides. This problem, I just have all three sides. So that means I have three different letters, A, B, and C. I don't have two of the same letter. So I can't use the law of sines again. I got to use cosines. But the question then is, which angle do I need to look for? Because I need to get all three of them, but which one should I get first? The question, or the rule of thumb is you need to find the biggest one. So we're going to look for C. So we're going to get angle C. That means that on our formulas, if you look back at these formulas, we're going to use this last formula. Because we want to get cosine of C by itself. So here's how it would go. You would put C squared, so 8 squared. Because this time we already know C, so that's going to be the number on the outside. Equals A squared, which would be 6 squared. Plus B squared would be 4 squared. Minus 2 times 6 times 4 times the cosine of C. This time the cosine of C is what we don't have. We don't have angle C. So if we're going to look for an angle, again, in our calculator, we're going to need an inverse because we got to find an angle. So we got to put an inverse into our calculator. So let's just multiply or do our squares. We got 64, we got 36, we got 16. Negative 2 times 6 times 4 is negative 48. And then we still have cosine of C. That one we don't know yet. How do I get cosine of C by itself? This is where your Algebra 1 skills come in handy. You got to combine these first, right? And then subtract it from 64. So you're going to get 64 equals 52, what you get when you add those together, minus 48 times the cosine of C. And then you're going to subtract 52 on both sides. So you're actually going to end up with 12 equals negative 48 times the cosine of C. Now, how do I get the cosine of C by itself now? You got to divide both sides by the negative 48. So you're going to divide by negative 48 on both sides. Okay, so that will get the 48s to cancel out. So you're going to end up with cosine of C equaling a negative 0.25 when you divide these two. 12 divided by negative 48 is negative 1/4, or negative 0.25. Now that doesn't look like an angle, because what do we have to do now in our calculator? We got to do the inverse. So cosine negative 1. In our calculator, cosine negative 1, and we're going to put in negative 0.25. Now the calculator knows that if you put a negative cosine in for the inverse, it's going to give you an obtuse angle. It knows that obtuse angles have a negative cosine value in here. We'll look at that when we talk about trig in the unit circle when we get there, but it's going to be an obtuse angle. So we'll do inverse cosine negative 0.25. You get 104.5 degrees. So the angle C right up here at the top is 104.5 degrees. Okay, so that's a lot of work, isn't it? You've got to plug it into the formula. Then you got to start using your calculator and get C by itself, and then do the inverse and get your angle. So I would not want to do that twice in one problem. So now that I have big C and little c, what can I use? I can do the law of sines now. It's a lot easier to use the law of sines than it is to use the law of cosine. So I'm going to do the sine of 104.5 over 8. That's going to be my sine of C over little c. And I'm going to solve for angle A this time. Sine of A over 6. Those would be my two ratios that would be equal to each other, so I can solve. So sine of A equals, so let's multiply sine of 104.5 times 6. Always close your parentheses in your calculator so that if you do 104 times, 0.5, you close it so it times it by 6. You don't want to put the 6 in the parentheses. And then you get that answer and divide it by 8. 0.7261. And then we need to put that on the inverse. So sine negative 1, 0.7261 in our calculator. And you get inverse sine 0.7261. Be careful not to use cosine. We're using sine now, law of sines. You get 46.6 degrees. So that angle A over here, 46.6 degrees. And then to get our last angle, angle B, just subtract them from 180. 180 minus 104.5 minus 46.6. And 180 minus 104.5 minus 46.6. 28.9 degrees is what you get. So angle B up here is 28.9 degrees. And then you got to step back and look at it. You got to make sure that it makes sense. Where's my biggest angle? 104.5. My biggest side is 8. So that does work. My smallest angle, 28.9, is across from my smallest side, which is 4. So that one does work. Alright, so there's your notes. Those law of sines, law of cosines, and we will practice some of those.